Good morning.
Okay. Oh, there's Joseph. How are you doing?
Not too bad, thanks.
Good, good. Right. So, yeah, we'll just kick off and topic today. Well, it's sort of a bundle of topics sort of under the guise of emerging risks, but I really need to update that because it's the risks that have emerged. It's I guess a sort of a range of issues that come across a number of aspects of site development, and essentially we're picking up on some of the sort of challenges of the site within its context in the landscape, the additional impacts from site operations in terms of sort of wider emissions to the environment, so from dusts, vapors and odors, as well as noise and vibration, and also just a sort of a nod towards archaeology as an issue. This is obviously a very sort of site specific activity in terms of sort of risk to development. So just want to pick up on some of the sort of high level issues there. And as ever, if there are any questions going through, or if you have any particular examples from your own experience, just chip them in. We'll all be sort of keen to hear. Certainly I am around a lot of these issues. So essentially, when we talk about sort of landscape side of things, really this is the sort of the fit of the site within the context of the landscape. We're dealing with an environment that has shape and form, topography. It also has previous features, and so what we also need to consider is how then this development, whatever it may be, is perceived by the community surrounding the site as it's developed. There may be buildings which are identified as being important historically, even though they might not be necessarily the best examples. There'll be the sort of acceptance or the assumption that the site is there and has been there, and so its development might unsettle residents, and that might then lead to other challenges with the site, and in particular sort of attitudes and reactions to development. So there's a whole bit of work around knowing who the sort of stakeholders associated with the site and its development might be, and how the management of that site then engages with those. So it might be that the developer has quite extensive community engagement activities taking place, a lot of effort to try and explain, perhaps if it is a major disruption to the local area, as to why that might be happening, and again to try and minimize the sort of issues individuals might have with the site itself. And so again, as part of that development process and the design of the site during its implementation, there are sort of major initiatives to try to reduce impacts and that issue of nuisance disruption of the site as perceived by external groups and individuals, as well as the sort of sensitive receptors that one would assume would be considered in the site development process. And there are lots of initiatives in construction in terms of trying to put forward a responsible and thoughtful approach to developments. I'll come back to it later on in terms of amenity value and, if you like, the sort of archaeology, and that archaeology might not be very old, but the sort of perception of the value of the site within the landscape by the stakeholder communities is critical. There are well-defined archaeological features on our landscape, so battlefields, heritage sites, and designated landscapes, conservation areas and gardens. And so again, how the development interacts with any of these, if they're present in close proximity or within the site itself, in terms of trying to sort of preserve areas. So just going through into the more discrete areas of impact, so dust emissions and odors, and essentially where you are handling loose material such as surface soils, or sort of implementing any subsurface construction processes, dust is a likely impact in terms of release from the site. And again, depending on the period of activity and the prevailing weather conditions, that then may disappear off site. Odor, essentially associated with any organic materials that might be on site, even if those are sort of already there and being disrupted. And again, sort of nuisance value of that activity as perceived by individuals in the wider community. So thinking in terms of control and essentially trying to minimize dust production, but also emission, using damping down techniques and technologies, so mists and sprays that can be set close to the operation site where the dust is being produced, and those essentially will also potentially impact on water that's generated on the site. Odor suppression can also be built into that, and there are additives that you can include in some of these sprays that are good at suppressing odor from degrading materials as well. But again, using that effectively requires you to understand the prevailing weather conditions during that development process. So what is dust and how do we measure it? Essentially, it's material that less than 75 microns in diameter, that is suspended and transmits through the air. So that will follow the sort of weather patterns and the air circulation. Smaller particles tend to be emitted from high temperature processes, so sort of cooking and sort of any heating steps, and also from combustion, fossil fuel combustion in mobile plant on the site. Biological materials can also be suspended, so again, any waste material that's present, and sewage that's associated with the site. Burning shouldn't take place, but I guess in most operations will at some point, and is very visual, but also creates quite significant impacts on the local environment in terms of both air quality and also inhibiting transport if these combustion points are significant. And the key issue here is that the suspended airborne material has big impact locally on respiratory tract, eyes, nose, and also in terms of the wider ecological context, a significant smothering effect when the dust is deposited. Monitoring a variety of different devices that give you real-time levels, but also it might be that as part of the site operation, ongoing boundary monitoring would be needed to demonstrate that the site was compliant or not with the air quality in the local area. And if there is a nuisance, with the nuisance from a local authority perspective, can result in an abatement notice or a fine for the site operation. So there are significant potential impacts from this type of disruption. So in terms of managing the site and any dusty operations, I've already mentioned in terms of trying to stop dust moving off site and to protect site workers, sprays and use of less friable materials, minimizing the amount of sweeping during dry periods, and containing those operations within a controlled environment. So active areas will have ventilation. Tools that are being used on site will have either dust extraction or vacuum collection on those particular devices. In addition, light pollution is another sort of issue in terms of disruption of the wider environment, and good screening and maintenance of those screens to try and reduce any off-site leakage to the wider environment. And then I guess a sort of a final sort of ongoing issue in terms of unwanted visitors to the site and material that can be disrupted by vandalism and the protocols you need to have to control. So again, that's sort of a balance of security systems, lighting and CCTV that need to be brought into the mix. So thinking through the sort of site operation, control of material that's being generated and released, and also controlling access to the site is critical. And again, we can revisit some of the sort of basic control methods, and these are sort of fairly logical in many respects, where you've got transport routes, again, ensuring that is planned to be away from major receptors, so that road sweeping and any sort of release from the location is minimized. Again, damping down and sweeping as an ongoing requirement. Where there is demolition taking place, then that has to be again controlled in terms of material handling. So where demolition wastes are generated, transporting them through closed chutes and covering them with netting, and where that demolition waste is perhaps being reused as a site material, that then the physical activity of sort of breaking it up and grading it takes place in a way that doesn't generate extra dusts. Mobile plant and vehicles on site, again, basic maintenance and cleaning to try and stop material moving around, and ensuring that there's adequate dispersal of exhaust fumes, so vertical exhaust pipes where possible. I know there is a sort of a lot of development taking place of electrical site vehicles and devices, perhaps still a little way off in terms of common application, but again, the operation and transport around the site needs management to try to minimize where potential dusts and releases can take place. So covering open truck loads and speed limits, etc. Already considered materials handling. Again, the sort of basic principles of protection and isolation from dispersal by sort of weather conditions, storage being minimized in terms of how much material is retained on the site, and ensuring that skips are covered, if you like, that the transfer of material is in particular solid material and aggregates and things like that, are transferred with a minimum fall height, just again to try to stop any dust and also noise from those handling processes. Where there are sort of significant amounts of concrete being used and generated, again isolating that so that it's enclosed, so that when mixes are made, that dust is minimized in terms of production. Any physical cutting, grinding, again, try to ensure that wet cutting, vacuum extraction, and dust extractors are used either on the individual tools, or the work takes place in controlled and covered environments. And again, just in terms of site housekeeping rules for transport of material around the site, reducing the amount of waste that's generated and stored, so particularly if it's organic and starts to degrade, and that any chemicals again are also considered on the basis of when they're being used, how likely they are to generate aerosol and be transported off the site. So again, that's dispensing and the use again critically thought through in terms of minimizing potential nuisance. So in terms of specifically focusing on air pollution, what do we mean by that? So I've already mentioned dust as a component, and essentially the mechanical processes taking place on the site will potentially generate that dust, and again cutting and grinding and also sort of high temperature combustion processes generate finer particles, and associated then with construction, plant and transport. The main pollutants that are monitored, these aren't all of the air pollutants, but these are a representative sort of set of air quality standards for sulfur and nitrogen oxides, particulate material, and we use the term PM10 2.5, which represents the sort of aerodynamic diameter of the particles, and PM 2.5 being much finer and much more of a threat in terms of respiratory impact. Ozone, a number of organic substances, including benzene and butadiene, carbon monoxide, and lead and other potentially toxic elements that are released during particular activities. Now, these are either directly emitted from pollution sources, but also some of them are generated or feed into photochemical reactions that can then move pollution impact away from the site over time. So whilst the generation at a location might not be so significant, a continued release could result in sort of downstream or sort of away from the site, sorry, downwind, not downstream, away from the site, secondary pollutants that are equally significant. And so when we have a construction and development site, then the operations and their contribution to air quality degradation may sort of impinge on local air quality management areas. So if a location has, for example, a particularly problematic transport system, then that would be controlled by transport strategies in the area by the local authority, and it might be that the additional vehicles that are being introduced by the site development then tips that over in terms of the sort of planned impact. So again, there may be issues around changes in air quality that might not have been expected. And also within the sort of air quality management context, controlling areas in terms of smoke generation and burning is an important consideration. So in terms of trying to monitor and control, a lot of the impacts are obvious in terms of dusts and emissions. So visual assessment is a pretty good way of checking things are okay. There are also lots of devices that are portable now that can be used to gather snapshot measurements of dust, for example, but also other vapors and fumes. If there are likely to be sort of significant ongoing concerns about air quality, then more robust monitoring might be required, and might be a requirement from the local authority, and installing sort of air quality monitoring points within the site, particularly at the boundary, just to keep an eye on how things are going. The process of monitoring is not trivial, it's not difficult, but it needs to be using appropriate systems that are calibrated, and generally I would expect that would be a specialist contractor that would be brought on to perform that. The sort of holiday snap there and the right hand side is a typical PM10 monitoring system that you'd see if you look at air quality monitors in local authority areas. You'll see the characteristic head sticking up above the green box, and it's that sort of device that might be used to collect information. Some of them are continuous monitors, others are sort of batch monitoring, so you'd collect for a period of time, then take a filter paper away and weigh it and work out how much dust has been generated over that period of time on average. So again, controlling and managing requires a sort of sequence of data gathering.
Paisley Town Hall on the previous slide. Was that for the Arnott's demolition?
Oh yes, well spotted. Yeah, this is a very, very, very old picture. Well, so are those two kids there, a couple of PhD students. We had a project with Renfrewshire Council to help set up the sort of air quality monitoring in the area and gather some data. So we had the Partisol and a number of different sampling heads set up at various locations. So this was a sort of an urban background location on the town hall balcony. And yeah, in the good old days when you could actually shop in Paisley.
Yeah, it looks quite different now.
Absolutely. So in terms of control, obviously going to the source is probably the most effective. So informing staff of dust and fume generation and the potential knock-on effects, the sort of continual sort of duty of care in terms of keeping parts of the site clean and reducing that dust, making sure that simple things like vessels holding volatile materials are sealed properly, and that certainly if there are operations taking place in buildings, then there's adequate ventilation for the operatives. But also if those are very, very dusty activities, then you do think about the sort of downwind off-site potential impacts, and that occupational limits are quite different from air quality management limits in the wider environment. Noise and vibration continue to climb up the priority ladder in terms of all our activities in development projects, and sort of background surveys and assessments during the development are normally required. The impacts of a lot of construction activities are inherently noisy. So wherever there is any transport or any cutting and handling, that can give rise to significant levels, and the propagation of that noise to the wider environment is very landscape and weather dependent, and can be a significant nuisance. The sort of priority we need to give it is really manifold in terms of why it might be important. There's an environmental context, particularly in terms of disrupting wildlife, but also put humans in that category as well, particularly if you've got residential areas close to the site. It can stop the project in terms of nuisance, and also where sort of particularly you're looking at foundations and piling, that type of intrusive activity can propagate to locations off-site and cause structural damage, which then is a big issue in terms of understanding the sort of relationship with stakeholders around the site, and it sort of wraps up into, you know, lots of potential issues around how the site is viewed and whether or not, you know, you'll then sort of stimulate more complaints. So some of the control ideas, suggestions. So keep to a planned program of work in terms of agreed times within reasonable working hours. Think about how material that's coming and going off site is dispatched to try to minimize disruption, going back again to reducing drop heights. If you're handling bulk materials, it's good for reducing dust, as I said before, but also in terms of noise. There may be quite effective screening methods for particular locations to try to reflect the noise back and keep it within the site. And noise suppression devices like doors and panels on mobile plant should be used and closed so that suppresses any emission. And I guess one of the easiest and most widely abused is the sort of reversing process of vehicles on a site, and thinking through how plant and vehicles move around the site in a way that they're not continually reversing backwards and forwards. So sort of the logistics again is important. Monitoring noise is again fairly specialist. There are noise levels and noise bands that can be monitored in terms of the levels and the frequencies. Vibration is more of a physical issue rather than a noisy issue, and what is certainly a challenge is to ensure that any monitoring that takes place allows the background and the impact of development operations to be compared, and how frequently noise levels are exceeded, and how those are then reported. A lot of factors contribute to generating noise and nuisance, and you know, what is the activity that's giving rise? So whether it's a bit of machinery or an intrusive physical disruption, the propagation of that noise away from that source to the wider environment is then determined by a lot of factors that associated with the structure of the site itself. So the sort of ground surface, any buildings, and topographic features will all influence the propagation. So thinking again in terms of site layout, where the sort of, I guess you can think in terms again of the source pathway receptor concept for noise, thinking through the various physical structures that would intervene and help suppress or conversely help propagate and focus noise to particular areas. Okay, so sort of moving on to archaeology and heritage. This is a very, very simple overview of what is potentially a significant impact. And the sort of overarching sort of principles are that within the site development, there are sort of ongoing, or there is ongoing awareness of the requirement to manage any remains that might be discovered, and how that management preserves or enhances the benefits of heritage within the site itself. Incorporating heritage materials within a development, again, is particularly important for developments in urban centres, but within the sort of planning process, the conditions will require that any discovery is recorded, and depending on the development plan, may be built into the development and preserved on site. The disruption of landscape close to heritage and archaeological sites that are already in existence, again, can be significant in degrading the value to the community. And so where that can exist, then thinking through from a site planning process how that might be incorporated is good practice. The challenge of listed buildings being close to boundaries of a site, and should that be ignored and unauthorized works take place, there is a risk that will be discovered, and the obligation is then on the developer to return that cultural heritage to its state before that interruption. And I've seen a couple of reports in the last year or two where particularly farmers may have disrupted barrows that have been on their land and taken soil away from sites to use elsewhere, and the local authorities come back and made them reinstate those features. And archaeology is incredibly diverse. Essentially, it's stuff that's been left around from the last ice age until yesterday. So we're dealing with a whole range of potential artifacts and cultural sort of history within the location in both rural and urban environments. There are significant features that if the sites have already been designated, then there must be minimal disturbance. If they're not designated but of value and discovered, there needs to be some sort of recording take place before any development destroys. Where you find human remains, work has to stop until it's been investigated, and sort of burial sites are not to be disturbed. The same for treasure recording and reporting needs to take place. In the marine environment, the sort of archaeology is a little bit more complicated, obviously because of the location, but it might be that we have historical artifacts from sort of industrial past in terms of aircraft and vessel remains, and any objects that were contained in caves and other features that had been inhabited on the coast, and any other artifact that might show evidence of human activity, and often that's quite difficult to see within that sort of subsurface environment. So within planning conditions, there may be clauses to sort of try to preempt any discovery if the landscape is known to have a history, although there aren't any recorded features. Then the fact that site development taking place will be disturbing that environment and potentially can result in that discovery process, and so sort of a bit of desk assessment needs to take place before the project starts, and certainly in terms of likely locations, trial pits and site investigation might be required. But again, is that something that's picked up in planning? Yeah, this is a little bit of a site near where I live, and the development called Castle Hill reflects the fact that there's a small earthworks that was in place around a big residential development, and you can see the sort of evidence of that is not very apparent from where you're looking from the road towards the site, but what took place before the development was a sort of sequence of investigations. So geophysical survey desk based assessment was undertaken, or were undertaken, to identify whether there are any likely significant archaeological features, a couple of trial ditches, and the sort of conclusion was that someone had been extensively farming that location over a long period of time, so any potential remains would have been disrupted. They weren't significant, therefore the development took place. In urban environments, it can be a bit more complex, and you can see here a lot of sort of extensive sort of foundations and archaeological features on this development site in London, and with these types of developments, we're continually turning over the land to a different development use. Then the recording process needs to be as effective as it can be, and so there's a lot of sort of technology in advances in terms of digital capture of buildings and sort of laser scanning of surfaces, so that we have as good a record of what was there as the site is developed. And I guess that's going to be one of the sort of more rapidly developing areas from the archaeological perspective. So in terms of this topic area, the sort of to-do that wanted to sort of pass to you is essentially looking at your case study site and seeing if there's any one of those emerging categories or all of them that you can make a comment on the potential implications. Most of them, I think, are upland anyway. There may be reference to archaeological risks, if you like, and you know, what would need to take place during the development phase. And that is all I wanted to cover in that area. I don't know if anyone has any comments, any examples of issues they've had or encountered in those areas.
I've had a site recently which just required an archaeological watching brief during some trial trenching. And then following that, we've done a geophysical survey to get more of an idea of what could be there. And that basically just said, it could be, or it could not be. Like, didn't really tell us anything that we didn't already know. So again, it's more just put the mitigation in place because you can't confirm either way what's under the ground.
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess it's a case of if you are obviously if you're developing a site in the middle of London, you're likely to find everything from Roman to medieval to whatever at some point, but it's likely that somebody's put a pile of concrete through it in the past when our sort of concern was less rigorously applied, whereas perhaps if you're in an upland area where there are sort of known locations, then how likely are you to encounter an undiscovered feature below surface? And yeah, it's quite tricky, I guess, in terms of being able to as you say, keep a watching brief as the site progresses. Great. Anyone, anything else? Everything okay with you? Grand. Okay, so again, I'll sort of encourage you to sort of put your little to-dos on the VLE as you can. I haven't done a quick look through today, but I'll have a wee run through what's there already. And I think this week, Thursday, you have Julie, the mental health and resilience side of things. Okay. Great.
Thank you very much.
Okay, I'll catch up with you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.